So I want to pick up on a couple things. So your description of life, of management as being frenetic. And, having worked with various bosses over the years, I sort of concluded that the bad ones didn't make decisions rapidly enough. And so my little theory on management was you have to be comfortable making a significant decision, whatever, roughly every 30 seconds, something like that. But, I also wonder, is that a trap? Is that, and particularly where email just brings so many more people, more challenges sort of into your inbox, that you actually do have a decision you could make every 30 seconds. That maybe that's a trap, that maybe that's not the definition of good management. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, it's so easy to get trapped. And frankly, personally, the issue is quite the same as for managers, that somehow you've got to check this thing obsessively and constantly and so on. You have chief executives calling, emailing on Sunday evening at 10 o'clock, calling a meeting for Monday morning at 9 o'clock, as if everybody's online all the time. People who send you an email and 20 minutes later say, bosses sending you an email and saying 20 minutes later, why didn't you respond? And all of that breeds a kind of management. Recently I was at a talk where somebody, a chief executive of a terrific entrepreneurial growing company, was saying that one of his key people is quitting because she said, I can't even golf and relax because I have to check my email. And he is a very articulate chief executive running a company that's absolutely dependent on the technology. Said, I've got to do something differently here. This is not on. We've got to do something differently.
Could I chip in on the science? Because I got challenged to study this. A lot of people talk about multitasking, and when you break it down, you're not actually multitasking. As human beings, very few of us can do more than one thing at a time. Driving maybe and listening to the radio, but most of us are not good at multitasking. What they discovered, these scientists who did the study, was that what we're actually doing is rapid task switching. So when we're plowing down a stream of emails, we're switching from this task to that task to the... And they're back to neuroscience, there are actually centers in your brain that get exhausted by that. It's kind of like you're going this way, that way, this way, that way. And I don't know about you guys, but at the end of the day, sometimes I'll be looking at my email and I just have this sense of complete futility. Because, I'm exhausted and I've done all that I can and it's still coming. So I do think that's a real issue. On decision making, two things I think are interesting in the conversation. The first is that good leaders, I think, don't make very many decisions themselves. I think what they do is orchestrate a decision process. And it's worth orchestrating a decision process for the really important decisions. And most of the other decisions can kind of get made in a way that is not going to damage the organization. I think we're sort of trained with this notion that decisions have to be precise and based on really good data and sound analysis and in-depth sort of research. And a lot of them really don't. Even if they're not the perfect decision, as long as you've got the ability to change later on, you can always go back and do a course correction. So I think don't make too many decisions would be kind of what I would think.
Mm-hmm. Texting reminded me, I wanted to mention something else, and your comment about texting reminded me, all of the technologies, and I'm going back to automobiles and telephones and television sets and everything else, it seems to me that all of them drive us to be more and more individualistic, more and more detached from communities, more and more detached from social relationships. You wrap all this hunk of metal around you called a car, and it's kind of get off my highway. And I'm isolated from everyone else. People don't tailgate on sidewalks, right? People don't tailgate you walking behind you on a sidewalk. Well, I was going to say, but of course they do. It's people who are texting who go bumping into you on the sidewalk. And that's another example of, it may be everybody's sidewalk, but I don't care. I'm busy texting away as I'm walking, and bang, they walk right into you, if not into a car. So even with the printing press, you didn't have to go to a library to get a book or do something social to get a book. When I first moved to France, it was very difficult to get a telephone. So people used to come knocking on the door. Gee, that's charming. Well, it's charming because they couldn't phone, so they knocked on the door. And there was a much greater sense of community. And every single technology has removed us from that sense of community. And that is very dangerous. And that, just a last comment, that's the third life. Okay, if the first life is work and the second life is home and play or whatever, then the third life is community. That's the third life. Yeah. And community is under threat, and that means society is under threat.
You know, in some ways I wish this panel had a millennial or two on it, because I wonder, and I hope when we get to questions, whether people might want to challenge the idea that community is as you've defined it, and not, there aren't new forms that are important and valuable and deep as well. And I hope we'll come to that. JC, did you want to?
Yeah, I wanted to thank Henry for doing something that I think is essential here, which is taking this huge problem of technology's impact and parsing it into pieces. And once we get it into pieces, we can talk about it more productively, I think. So Henry was saying we need to think about it at a personal level, as well as at an organizational level, and at a societal level. And I think it's absolutely incontestable, and we'll be hearing from Sherry Turkle at this point, that modern telecommunications are destroying our capacity to engage in conversation. Now, one of the things that we do know, we don't know much about management, but one of the things we do know about effective managers is that they are very self-regarding, self-monitoring, self-aware, not only of themselves, but of course the impact that they're having on other people. And I think it's incontestable, and I think both Rita and Henry have made this point, it's incontestable that modern telecommunications, the cost of keeping us in touch all the time is that we're losing the space that we ground ourselves in order to monitor ourselves, in order to reflect on ourselves and the impact that we have on others. So it's exactly like distracted driving. My understanding, there may be some experts in the audience who know this, but something like 25% now of road accidents are due to distraction, and these have been significantly increased by texting and phones and so forth. So if we think that road accidents as a result of distracted driving are a problem, let's think about the social and economic accidents from distracted managing.
That's a great phrase.
Lovely, lovely, very nice. Yeah, it's funny, isn't it, as a reflection of individuality, that we know that talking on a telephone, even hands-free, is dangerous, but no jurisdiction or barely any bother or have the courage to stop that. So they all stop holding they discourage or penalize the holding of the telephone, but it's okay to have a conversation hands-free when we know it's a problem.
But we're all making a very strong case for driverless cars, for the next generation of technology.
Well, yes.
Sure.
Aren't we? Or why not? In a sense, you've solved a couple of the problems that happened in the transitional phase.
I like the report of the driverless cars. I used to be a car nut. I like the report of the driverless cars that are both stuck at a roundabout because each is looking to the other to move first, because of course driverless cars have no eyes and we don't make eye contact, which is the way, in fact, we negotiate roundabouts, is by making eye contact with the other drivers.
Yeah, to take the other side.
So they're stuck there forever, like Buridan's ass.
I'd love to have a driverless car so I could turn around and have a conversation with everybody in the car, so the technology can enhance community. Yeah. That would be wonderful, but I don't know a lot of examples where the technology enhances the sense of community. Sitting in a room with people on a screen having a meeting is a lot better than trying to do it by mail or trying to do it by phone alone. So you do get a sense of conversation. But there was a wonderful story about a company where a woman in Geneva, I think it was hated by the people at the headquarters in New York because she kept demanding everything. She demanded this and she demanded that in email. And it was only when she visited the States that they realized she was using the French word demander, which means to ask, and she thought that meant to ask, and it meant to demand. But they had to be face to face to work that out.
Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So okay, so we can lament technological change, applaud some. We could go on all day with that, but obviously there's a force at work, and a lot of this is inevitable. So maybe the question then is, and Henry, you started to get at this. What does the ideal organization look like? Given the need to sustain some of these basic management principles that we probably all share. But then the reality of a changing workforce with different experience and expectations, with a different attitude toward technology, and then the more positive, the opportunities, the technology, that's social. That we haven't even talked about consumers yet. The ability to connect with consumers in a new way. I mean, it's a big question, but does anybody want to sort of try to draw? We should do this. We should not do this as we kind of build the ideal organization, the ideal kind of management approach in the future.
This sounds like you, Rita.
Does it?
Everyone wants to hand that one off.
I can make a couple comments. I agree with Rita about the need for more project-type organizations. Warren Bennis coined the term adhocracy a long time ago, and there seemed to be a trend even over the last 50 years or more that contemporary industries tend to move towards a project organization, not necessarily because of the information technology, but because of the need for innovation and the need for project teams. So if you're working in advertising or you're working in filmmaking, then you obviously organize by teams. That's been a trend and probably enhanced. The other side of that coin is that, as I described at first, if managers are losing it and are becoming more detached from their organizations because of spending time on these technologies, partly because it takes time away from other things, but also because of the nature of being in touch with a keyboard and nothing else, then there's going to be a tendency for their organization to become more and more bureaucratic, because the management of those organizations is going to be disconnected from the operations of those organizations. And frankly, the more technology we see, the more of that kind of bureaucratic management I see. So there's a complete disconnect. I maintain that any manager, any chief executive who allows him or herself to be paid 300 or 400 times as much as the workers is not a leader. Okay, and that means almost all the CEOs of the Fortune 500 are not leaders by that definition. The whole separation of leadership from management implied. Management's about rolling up your sleeves and getting dirt under your fingernails, and leadership detached from management is devoid. It's bureaucratic. It's unhelpful. But just one last comment is, by the way, Peter Drucker made the same distinction, except he made it between managers and administrators. It's kind of amusing in a way.
That is interesting.
So I mean, this Henry's forcing a distinction between two types of technology. Again, these distinctions are useful and help clarify the discussion. A technology of production and a technology of surveillance. And these are two very different kinds of technology, and clearly there's been enormous advance in the technologies of surveillance. And I'm sure many people in this room have experience of call centers and have done some research on call centers as being one of the kind of current sweatshops, but there's insufficient movement to get sweat because the time you take to go to the bathroom is clocked. So these two fundamentally different technologies, technology of production, which is magnificent and interesting and produces new products, and a technology of surveillance, which is now not only company-wide but becoming nationwide. And thanks to the NSA, I've no doubt they're noting what's going on here as we speak.
So when I think, to come back to how would you design an ideal organization, I don't think we know, but I think we've got some early glimmers. I think organizing around projects is kind of where I see a lot of organizations going because of the benefits it produces. It gives you more flexibility. People don't adhere to a rung on the organizational ladder and sort of cling there forever because they know things have got to change. So I think that's one. I think really great information systems, and by that I don't mean the surveillance type. I mean, total transparency about what the numbers are, a total agreement about one instance of the same data, And I would say most organizations today are just so far behind in being able to get the information you need to make those high-quality decisions in a timely way. I mean, if you look at most organizations' technology stacks today, and I'm not talking about just communications, but what runs your payroll, what handles your travel and expense budget. You've got stuff out there from the 60s, from the 70s, from the 80s. And so I think a lot of organizations are really flying blind. So when I look at the ones that are very effective, you see a couple of things. Project-based, very good technology underpinnings, one instance of the truth, that kind of thing. An ability to be very transparent about what's going on so that when there is a problem, the skill of the managers can be put to work to solve that problem because we know it exists, right? Alan Mulally, who just stepped down recently as the CEO of Ford, has a great phrase that I think it's worth all of us remembering. He says, "You can't manage a secret." You can't manage a secret. If we can get it out there, if we can get the data there, we can do something about it because collectively we have the intelligence to do that, providing we can focus, Oh, by the way, he forces his managers to do that. He has this 4-hour-long weekly meeting, no devices, no side chatter, everybody focused on the task at hand. He forces this reduction in distraction, and that's, I think, really key to how he has been quite successful in managing. So, and then I think the third thing is this ability to, and I like your phrase, Henry, building community. If you look at companies that, even very asset-intensive companies like 3M, for example, they will tell you that a lot of what causes their innovations to be successful, and they're very famous for their 15% time you can spend on whatever you want. But one of their senior leaders was at a conference I was just at, and he described a process I thought was really very interesting, which was, he said, what we do at 3M is we tend to hire people and they tend to stay with us for a long time. So that creates the continuity, but it is project-based, so they move from project to project doing whatever they do. And he said the 15% time comes from the social ties that the researchers and chemists and so forth have built, which allow them to help each other on projects. And so there's this permeability of your immediate assignment that I think we'll start to see really effective organizations do more and more of. And then I think that the last thing I would call out as sort of an early glimmer of maybe where we're going is a quest for some kind of superordinate goal or whatever. This morning the discussion was about massively transformative purposes. Well, we're not all going to be changing the lives of 1 billion people. Maybe we will, but I think it's sort of a stretch to think every organization is going to try to do that. But I do think we can strive for excellence in whatever we want. So a great example of this is the Indian bank, HDFC Bank, which has as its stated goal to be a world-class Indian-based bank. And they started in the 1980s, and they've been very successful, very steady growth, very stable company. But everything reinforces this quest for excellence. So I'll give you a trivial example. If you go to their website, the HDFC Bank website, there's the About Us section, where they have information for investors and the normal stuff a company has, but they have something else. There is a specific tab devoted to awards. And the awards are grouped by year. Now, do you want to be the leadership team in place the year there are no awards to put on the awards part of the website? No. So it's kind of reusing technology and other things to reinforce the real superordinate goal of the corporation. I think that's some of what we're starting to see.
So Chairman Andrew asked us to be practical as possible. So here's a very, kind of small... Practical.
God, you're so normative, Adi.
I wouldn't insult you. And so this is a small question, but it might be revealing. I would guess most of us who are managers, a lot of us, all of us, we get to the office and the first thing we do is fire up our computer and attack our email inbox. What should managers do when they first walk into their office each day? Somebody say make coffee?
This is your area. Absolutely.
What should good leaders do? There's the temptation to get locked into the sort of email inbox, which we've talked about, how constricting it is, how distracting it is.
Well-
What should leaders do the moment they walk into the office?
Okay, we're managers, or managers/leaders, because
Yeah.
I think they're the same. There was a deputy minister in the Canadian, that's sort of the senior civil servant in a major department in the Canadian government, who said he communicated with his staff every morning on email starting at 7:30. That's not what you should be doing, especially first thing in the morning. I think your secretary or your assistant should put thumbtacks point side up on your chair for about half the day, so that you get out and walk around and know what's going on in your organization. I think I remember one guy, another case of government, but I think it's no different in business. He was the kind of head civil servant in the UK of a number of major health aspects for older people, services for older people, for handicapped, and so on. He said he spends every Friday in the field in a different agency. First, he sees the clients without the professionals. Then he sees the professionals without the managers. Then he sees the managers. That's an example of kind of touching base. I mean, somebody running a supermarket chain who went shopping every Saturday in his own stores. I mean, these are obvious things, but if you're so tied up with the other thing, you've got to do a certain amount of looking at mail and so on, but if you think that's front and center, major part of your job, be careful. Interact, build community, enhance people's feelings about the company or the organization and their feelings about it. Firing 5,000 people every time you don't make your numbers on Wall Street is the absolute perfect way to destroy community. And it's done so casually, it's almost like automatic, or it has been for years. Absolute madness, absolute sheer madness.
Mm-hmm. So I'll weigh in too, or did you want to go first, Jason?
My management experience is horrendously varied, from being an entrepreneur to being a naval officer. It seems to me that the question is irrelevant for the entrepreneur, because you get in the office and you immediately are A, surprised that you've still got a company, and B, you get swept up with the current panic. I learned something I thought was profound at the time, and thinking back on it, I still think it profound. I went through a period of buying and selling companies, and I remember going to a French construction company which we were thinking of buying, and the managing director walked around, and this was the days before digital cameras, so you can tell how old the story is, and he'd take a photograph of the things that he really didn't like, which he would then feed back to his managers, saying, I am looking, okay, Big Brother is watching. But then my most recent managerial experience was at the dean of a business school. Now, there's some business school deans here, Jochen. Right. I think that the thing to do is to get a sense of the spirit of the place. That's the first thing. I think doing emails first is protecting you from exactly getting a sense of what's going on. So a kind of version of management by walking around, whatever it is you need to do to get a sense of what's going on and to feel the other people. So I think that would be my prescription, though I hesitate to give prescriptions on such matters.
So I guess I'd weigh in on another practical aspect, which is going to the office and doing email first puts you in reaction mode, because you're not in charge of who wrote those emails or what they wanted from you or whatever. So I think to be a strategic leader, it's very important to identify what your priorities really are. So here's an exercise I do a lot of times. I get called into a company and they say, we really have a struggle with innovation. We just don't have innovation around here. And so I'll say, okay, well, send me the last 3 meeting agendas that you guys used when important people got together to talk about important stuff. And I'll get them, and I'll take a highlighter pen, and I'll sort of highlight where does innovation or new business development or whatever they say is in quality, whatever they say is important to them pops up on the agenda. And 9 times out of 10, it's item number 15, right next to material safety data sheet update. And what does that tell you? You know, unless you're going out and systematically hiring the most idiotic people that you can find, people are not stupid, right? They know what you're paying attention to. So kind of back to your notion of distraction, Henry, I think if you're really going to strategically help an organization move in a direction you've decided you want it to, you have to be very clear on what your priorities are, and then you need to get ahead of the things that will try to derail you and distract you and get you out of the way. And where you start is your agenda, so take a highlighter pen. If you say innovation's important, where is it? If you have a meeting and you don't discuss innovation at all, people understand you're not paying attention to it, so you're not going to do it. The second thing is your calendar. And I'll do this exercise with companies too. I'll sit a manager down and I'll say, okay, you know, print out your calendar, print out, say, 2 weeks, and I want you to take a highlighter pen and highlight on that calendar anywhere these things that you declared to be strategically important are paid attention to. So I think part of the hard thing about management is it's so seductive to get swept up in the, you know, this person really wants to talk to me, or I need to weigh in on this or whatever, without really asking the question, well, does this advance our priorities or not? And so to me, I'm not sure I wouldn't just kind of make sure there's no fires burning first thing in the morning, but the next thing I would do is sort of think about my priorities, think about what else needs to happen that day, and what am I going to do to move that agenda forward.
Mm-hmm. Henry, let me ask you, you know, so there are times when we need to adapt, when we need to, you know, adopt new technology to make a shift to survive. You know, these are often accompanied by a sort of corporate restructuring. They're very disruptive. You know, is there a better way? Is there a better approach to these transitions?
Well, you know, when a company has its back against the wall, clearly it's got to do something dramatic, you know, in lieu of bankruptcy. But that's not mostly what we've been seeing for many, many years. What we've been seeing is rather casual firings in great numbers, and it's not helpful. I remember years ago when it was so much the rage that when IBM, which probably didn't meet its targets for a quarter or something, refused to do it, the stock analysts came down on them really hard. So you want a solution? Yeah. Change something about the stock market. Number one, quarterly earnings is just ridiculous. That this idea that a company will change course or change, you know, huge, massive company will change from one 4-month period is just silly and brings up all kinds of short-term perturbations. But the other thing is to get out of the stock market or off the stock market in the first place, as long as it's been functioning the way it has. I spoke to a chief executive of a company who has actually private investors, but he said publicly in a forum I was attending in Montreal that he's so sorry he did that. They're sharks. They drive him to do things that he thinks is dysfunctional. So be careful where your money comes from, and be careful who's lending your money, or if you're a co-op, you're going to have to do it through bank loans and retained earnings, and not through investments of any kind. There are other ways to build enterprises. You know, you've got REI in the United States, you've got Mountain Equipment Co-op in Canada. They built up to large size. They did it with a co-op kind of structure. There are other ways to do things. Companies like Tata have shares on the stock market, but family trusts control the company. So and that actually benefits this. If you judge Tata as it's been, that benefits the shareholders in a way, but it takes away these very mercenary kinds of pressures on companies that I think are absolutely dysfunctional. You know, you start entrepreneurially, you start with energy and enthusiasm and ideas and new things. Then comes the IPO, then comes the stock market pressures. You've probably started to saturate your traditional markets anyway, so then you start turning to a bunch of political strategies. You buy your competitors, you try and move towards a monopoly position, you lobby the government like mad, which these days is a very easy thing to do in the United States, increasingly in most countries. And then you function in completely dysfunctional ways. And there's so much of that going on today. So much. You know, I applaud all the corporate social responsibility that's going on, but it will never deal with the amount of corporate social irresponsibility that we're seeing. And Volkswagen, believe me, is just the tip of the iceberg.
So I want to pivot a little bit. So Rita, I want to ask you to talk a little bit more positively about technology. You know, we are tending to sort of talk about the disruptions and talk about the evil. So let's take a different scenario, which is, you know, a leader, a manager who, you know, who knows they need to adapt to survive, who figures there is a technology solution. We're not very good at sort of identifying the present, right? Let alone the future. Our boards are often not very savvy at any of this. We haven't required that of our boards, that they have a kind of technological sophistication that would actually help. So let's imagine there is a positive technological change out there. You know, how do managers, you know, in your experience, locate the right ones? Again, you talked about rapid prototyping, but you know, beyond that, how do you know how to make the plunge, when to make the plunge, where to make the plunge?
Well, in my world, it starts with really looking at your portfolio. And just briefly, there's stuff you're doing that's innovative in your core business, and that has to be your first priority, because if that goes away, you don't have money to do much else. Then there are things that are candidates to be your next core business, and that's something that you need to do to get towards the future. And then I think you need to invest in what I call options, which are small investments you're making today that buy you the right but not the obligation to make a future investment down the road. And where I see managers making a big mistake with embracing new technologies is they don't have enough options, or they're not paying enough attention to them. So I'm a big advocate for managers getting with their boards, saying here's the new things we're kind of trying, and sort of embedding the entrepreneurial notion in the portfolio of things that you're running. Now that has implications. It means you need to set aside some budget for things that are going to be more experimental, and you know they're going to have high failure rates because we just don't know enough to predict technologies going forward. But if you have those options, you can get much more of an early warning on what's coming down the road than you would if you had to wait till it was sort of announced in Business Week or at the FT or whatever later on. So I think the first part is having some experimental investment that is not held to the burden of the existing business. Second thing is something they do, for example, at Lego, which is at the end of every year. Every division has to contribute a certain percentage, I think it's 10%, of their profits to a common pool, and they, as a team, decide where those resources are going to go. So the resources aren't kind of trapped in each individual business, but each person feels empowered to have a voice in where those things should go. And because it's very transparent and they have a terrific corporate culture, they make those decisions, which could be very painful in another context, you know, more easily. I'm not going to say really easily. So I think part of it is how you invest your resources, how you spend your time, and then in the inclusiveness of bringing people along on that journey. And I also would say really connecting with customers. I couldn't reinforce that enough, what you were saying, Henry, which is really getting out there and seeing and experiencing and being with your customers and seeing what technologies are influencing them. I had a recent experience with senior executives at a South American beverages company, and we made them go out into the streets of New York City on a Monday night. And they came into the room, and they were like, oh, God, this is going to be so boring. People don't go drink beer on Monday, and it's awful. And they came back the next day, and their eyes were like saucers. And they said, my God, there's Monday Night Football. There's a bar with 13 screens, and each screen is showing a different sport. And there are people who are simultaneously drinking a beer, talking on their phone, watching television, and holding a conversation with two people next to them. This is amazing. And I said to them, well, they're a big global company. I said, don't you guys do this? Oh, no. We never have the time to go and do that. We're never given permission to go and do that. And I just thought that was very telling that, you know, I mean, going out and looking at a bunch of people drinking a beer is not a difficult or expensive thing to do, and yet these guys never did it. So I think it's also what expectations you set for how people get out there and really see what's going on.
So I'd like to open up to questions. I think there are tweeted questions coming in, but you know, why don't we do like the last panel, take 3 questions from the floor and then figure out how to respond. There's one here, there's one here, and then there are a couple in the back. So.
Good afternoon. I see you were crowdsourcing research on distraction. I brought some. What were the findings? That we are being interrupted every 11 minutes on the average knowledge worker. And the concentration times that you have to concentrate back to what you've done before add up to 2.5 hours per day in person, which means it like dramatically damages the productivity in the company. And seeing that we have like double the information in the society every year, we see this happen in the company too. So we had 1,000, Harvard published this year, we had 1,000 letters per year on manager in the 70s. And this year, or like last year, this year, it's 30,000. This averages to 4 letters per day in the 70s and 125 today. If you have a call center agent, he's doing 100 emails per day, and then he's done 8 hours. Thank you.
Okay, great. I don't know.
Hi.
There.
Hi. I'm not a millennial, but I do work in digital technology. So I want to throw a few statements out there and maybe put a more positive spin on what's being said about technology. The first thing is I just want to say email, if you're using email as your primary tool of communication, you're already old school. Okay? Secondly, on the topic of community, I would like to just say a couple of things. One of those is I think technology actually helps build communities, certainly geographically distributed communities. For me, on a personal level with my family, my grandmother is in touch with her grandchildren in 10 different countries in a way she would never have been before then. Secondly, in terms of what we're doing within technology, we're not at a static point. And already working on the next stage of disruption. And the key topic in technology at the moment is about building meaningful connections and helping companies interact with the public, with the communities in a more meaningful way. Because right now, the power isn't with the companies, it's with the general public. They have a way of effecting sea change. And I'd just like your thoughts on that distributed feedback loop that's currently in place.
Great. And one more. There are a couple in the back. Maybe we can sort of mix it up a little bit. Well, that's back-ish.
Hi. I would like to see if we could merge as well the topic from the first session. I would like to ask whether you see technology replacing of some sort management. There is lots of interesting developments now with blockchain. So I would like to get your comments on that.
All right, so we have a few topics. Technology replacing management. That technology can actually enhance community. It's a different definition of community, and if you're not on Slack, you're an idiot. But then the more negative thing that there is so much lost time, the distraction, the interruption. I would preface whatever you guys want to say by companies U.S. companies are very efficient these days. I know there's a lot of lost time, but they are producing, as they're productive and efficient. The stock market is rewarding that. They're not creating jobs, and that's a huge problem. And I think we do need to bring this back to companies being effective and proficient, but also in the Peter Drucker terminology, keeping focus on the human element. But who would like to pick up on any of these?
I'll start.
Yeah.
So I think the first thing about the notion of creating communities in a different way is more and more competitive advantages are going to companies that can create complete experiences. So if you think about it in kind of waves of automation, we had automation that replaced labor. You can kind of think of that as execution. We had automation that replaced knowledge work, and you can think of that as expertise. And now we've got automation that's aiding our attempt to create empathy and connection. And I'm very optimistic about that. I really see people using those technologies in a very proactive way. So if you think about the experiences you really like and would pay for, there's often a lot of technology behind them, but it's the authenticity of the experience that people are really looking for. And then just briefly, how are certain managerial functions getting replaced by technology? One of the things I'm seeing as a very interesting and I think positive development is now instead of somebody's intuition or gut telling companies what to do, especially at a very face-to-the-customer kind of level, people are now running experiments. We don't have to guess. We can actually find out if putting the glass here versus there makes a difference to consumer behavior. And it's very interesting if you look at how this stuff has been tried in political campaigns, that just changing the subject line, just changing the length of the email. I mean, I was hearing from a guy that did some work on the Obama campaign, and you know the most effective subject line they found in deliberately driving donations, small donations, to Obama? The most effective subject line was, "Hey." Who would have thought? It wasn't "dear friends," it wasn't "dear colleagues," it wasn't "fellow liberals." I mean, it was "hey." But you know, today you can actually find that stuff out. So I think a lot of tasks that managers used to do, because they were the ones who were sort of on point to do them, are now being replaced by our ability to actually experiment in real time and find out.
There are certainly areas where technology enhances community, and I think the example of family is an interesting one in keeping in touch. The interesting thing about that is the family knows each other already. And so the technology enhances the sense of community that was established in a different way, established by growing up together and so on. You can imagine trying to do that with family you never met. So maybe, you know, the family split after the war or after something or other in Syria or whatever, and people didn't grow up together, and suddenly they try and connect through Skype or something and create the sense of family community without really having met each other. It'd be an interesting experiment to see how that would work. My guess is it wouldn't work all that well until finally they got together, met, spent some time together, then they can go home and enhance their sense of community by using the technology. So it's definitely two-sided, and I think, you know, when people have established those personal relationships, then they can do it. I don't think there's any substitute when it comes to the most critical, certain of the most critical work in organizations, namely innovation and doing things differently and so on. There's no substitution for people working face to face in small groups. In small groups. You know, Friedman, in one of his New York Times columns, talked about an Egyptian friend who commented on the manifestation. Montreal word, we use the French for English, but on the things that took place in Tahrir Square in Cairo, and his Egyptian friend said that the social media are great for communication but not for collaboration. And I think that's really quite telling. Technology replacing management. I mean, at the extreme, you can sort of, you know, move the person out and put a sort of box there or something, which obviously we're not talking about. But, you know, we have images of things like managing. Try and go search in a library. Libraries are places where they keep books. Has anybody? I don't know if anybody remembers that. But try and search for books that tell you, based on empirical work, exactly what goes on in a manager's office. I happen to have authored 2 of them, but there are very few books that do that. There are hundreds, thousands of books that talk about the myths of management and the abstractions of management and the sort of the wonders of leadership, and just on and on ad nauseum. Some days I kind of feel if I hear the word leadership anymore, I'm going to sort of, you know, take out my ears or something, but block out my eyes. But we don't deal with the realities of what managing is. We deal with this myth of what managing is. And you know, when managers think that they plan, organize, coordinate, and control, which were Henri Fayol's initial words. There was a 5th one in 1916 about what management is. And when you sit and watch a manager and saying, okay, when are you controlling? When are you planning? When are you organizing? Those are all words for controlling anyway. And you observe a manager and say, gee, he's spending or she's spending 50% of their time dealing with people outside the unit. Is that planning or organizing or coordinating or controlling? So when your image or myth of the job doesn't correspond with this hectic, interrupted, job, then you're in trouble. And I think even the question of technology replacing management implies a view of management that I think does not exist.
Your distraction research, the first question, I think this is wonderful research. I think you should do more of it. I think the more that we understand the impact of new media on everyday life, I think, is a significant point. So, I mean, this is case closed. I think you've made the point. The third question about technological displacement of managers, and the code word blockchain. Clearly, there's going to be a shift in what machines do before managers get their hands on it, and what machines do after managers have got their hand on it. But I think the more interesting question is raised by this idea of communication and developing meaningful connections. So I like this idea. Now, it's quite clear to all of us that corporations are locus of power. And, Rita talked about transparency. At the same time, old-style economists, Veblen in particular, said, unless there is secrecy, there is no possibility of profit. So the management of the secret, as far as I'm concerned, is management of what is essentially the core of production of profit. Now, it's quite clear, I think also, that modern telecommunications are threatening the extent to which secrets can be managed. I mean, we see this, the Snowden issues, we see this in whistleblowers and so forth. So a very current problem, as far as I can see, for managers today is to manage the secrets on which the profits depend. And as far as I can see, there's very little discussion of this. We're seeing the whole question of the emails in the Clinton campaign and so forth. We now have a very significant problem with the management of digital media, in addition to the management of printed media, and smuggling blueprints out under your Macintosh, and to say nothing of human conversation, meeting in pubs, and so forth. I think this presents managers with a substantial new dimension of the problem of how to manage the secrets on which the profits actually depend.
Mm-hmm. So why don't we do a lightning round of one more round of questions from the floor. I know there's some sort of in the back here. Maybe take a couple there.
Thank you. I'm interested at this point of distraction, which I agree with Henry, who I think has been brilliant today, by the way. Has not had enough research. And I just want to go against what the lady in the front said slightly from the digital media sector. My view is that the digital media sector now is pushing new, more fancy ways of communicating with each other, when actually the demand seems to me to be in the opposite direction. Lots of managers and leaders I speak to say that interruption, distraction is absolutely destroying their productivity. And someone in the digital media sector, if they want to pioneer a new product, might find a way of which you can send a message to somebody and they, in a blink of an eye, can tell you without responding to you that they've read it, they've noted it, and they will deal with it in X amount of time or X amount of hours or days. And I just wondered if the panel thinks that perhaps that's where the real innovation is going to be in digital communication, and not in the yammers and the instant messaging services which just make it more and more easy to distract and appeal for a response in seconds, when actually most people need hours or days to do a proper response that's going to be meaningful.
Okay, great. And let's take one more, and then we'll respond to two questions.
Hi. I just wanted to ask and build on the comment that we need to change something in the stock market. I've been building digital products since the dawn of the internet, and in big corps, the issue is always finance. They want expectations, they have 3-year plans, yet I'm absolutely on board with what Ruth has said about, I call it expedition planning, is how I look at it. We go on a bunch of different expeditions, but finance doesn't like expeditions. Who's doing this well, and what changes do you see in the finance world and to help us build this new agile way of thinking, agile for finance?
So why don't we get one response to each of those questions? The first, building on distraction, the second on stock markets, finance. Who was the first?
Well, I'll start with some new technology that can help you manage the inbox is kind of the holy grail, right? So Microsoft just developed this new thing called Clutter. You guys seen this in your Outlook? And I've been very amused by this because the only thing in my Clutter file is the email announcing its existence. So it hasn't been very effective. I don't know. It's how do you tell what's important and what's not? On the more serious topic of the financial community, I think this is a key senior leadership team and board responsibility. And as a tangible example of how hard this is, when Ivan Seidenberg came into the leadership role at Verizon, which is one of our big wireless carriers, he looked at his portfolio, again, back to portfolio management, and said, physical phone books, landline telephony, probably not growth areas. And he sold those businesses off, generated the cash, and poured it into direct connections to the home and other new businesses that were fairly uncertain at the time. And the markets howled. Oh my God, they put him through the ringer. They said, how can you get rid of these stable cash-generating businesses and go into these weird new things that nobody's really, expeditions, I love that word. And Seidenberg's response was, look, I'm going to take a company that's growing at 3% a year, and I'm going to give you back a company that's going to grow at double digits. And if that's not the kind of company you want, then I'm the wrong investment for you. So I think part of the solution is leadership. But I think we're also slave to what my colleague Steve Deming would call kind of one of the worst ideas in the world, which is that companies should be managed almost exclusively for the benefits of their shareholders. And that's led to all kinds of rather toxic follow-on effects. You know how long the average shareholder in an American corporation holds the shares on average? 7 days. They're not actually people, they're computers, and they don't actually know whether you're buying Rubbermaid or Honeywell or Tupperware. They're just operating on algorithms. And so, I think our institutions, and this is a beautiful example of one, have just not caught up with what companies need to do to thrive and be healthy.
I want to dodge the financial question, because I belong to the group of crazies who think that the financial situation is already imploding and we're heading for another financial catastrophe. So our ideas about how the financial systems might be changed for the better, I think we're going to get into a dispute. But I think the distraction theme that we've surfaced in this session, I think, is a very interesting one. And I was reminded, and some of you are old enough to know, that in the early days of email, you used to be able to write an email and know whether or not it had been read. And one of the great retreats was when Microsoft, the early days of Microsoft Outlook came out. It had no facility for you as a sender discovering whether or not the email had been read. And as far as I know, no email systems today have that function that was there in the original green screen ones. But I mean, the basic point is, surely management calls for considerable judgment, calls for considerable reflection, no matter how much data, no matter how immediate or it is. And reflection requires a space, some kind of space in time or space in your head in which to do the reflection about the things that are yours in the way that Fayol said, because they cannot be delegated. They cannot be delegated because they can't be described and they can't be evaluated. These are the things that end up on your desk no matter how hard you try and get rid of them. And these are things that require reflection. And the point that has come through very clearly in this session about modern technology destroying the ability to reflect, I think is one of the things that demands our attention very much.
Fantastic. I've mismanaged this. I actually didn't get to any of the tweeted questions. There were some good ones, but we're all around for the next couple of days. So, please join me in thanking this fantastic panel, and thanks for all of you for contributing.